Well, we're going to have a demonstration and a lecture this morning about pre-Columbian tool manufacturing by Native Americans. These are all tools that are replica tools. None of them are real artifacts. And I've made them over the course of several years using all kinds of different materials, and all these materials were available to the pre-Columbian Native American people right from nature. They're all stone, bone, wood, antler, and things like that. So the first thing Native American people needed to do when they needed to make things to live with was to find a source of stone that was suitable, that could be broken and produce sharp cutting edges. And all of these stones are highly siliceous or contain a lot of silica, just like glass. Glass is made from sand. And they fracture in a certain specific way. It's what's called conchoidal or conchoidal fracture. And you find these in this area of Jefferson. I think the closest source is in Cobleskill, north of here. And in West Creek in Cobleskill, you can find a lot of what's called Esopus chert. A lot of people refer to cherts as flint. And you can use those words interchangeably, although there are slight differences. So anyway, if we find our first chunk of chert, it's not too unusual looking. It's very dark. And when you find these in streams, the way you identify them is they're very angular. They tend to tumble in the streams when the stream waters are high, and they break in an angular fashion. So this you can see has many sharp angles on it. It's not round like a hammerstone would be. These are polished in a stream. They're different material, so they don't break the same way. So the first thing you would do is you have to make edge tools to do all the making of all the other tools. So you start off with a piece of chert like this using a hammerstone. And you just hit it right and it should break. There we go. Okay, that's one big thick flake that just came off. So what we would do would be to continue to drive flakes off of this until we got a nice pile of them. And then once we had a pretty good pile of these flakes, we could use them as tools. Take this big thick one. It's got a very sharp edge on it. It's a heavy piece, so you can use this. We'll just take this. This is a piece of hard maple twig. And you can see how a tool like this can pretty quickly shave or plane this piece of wood down. And working with a flake tool like this, we can do a lot of work on wood, also on bone or antler. Anything that's not as hard as this tool, we can cut with this tool. From these blocks and flakes or spalls of chert or flint, you could then make a bunch of other tools like large knife blades like this. This is a blade that's made from a Western chert, Western U.S. chert, and it's hafted to bison, the vertebrae, the hump bone of the bison, and it's attached with sinew and with spruce pitch as a glue. And we'll talk about sinews in a minute. You can also make arrowheads, small arrowheads from these flakes that you produce. And you can make spear points like these. So the basic material for making the cutting tools is the chert or flint blocks that are broken down into smaller pieces. Okay, so Now we move into hunting tools. One of the next things a native person would need to do would be to procure food, meat, and hides and sinews and things that are needed to make clothing. So way back after the ice age, when the glaciers melted back about 13 to 14,000 years ago, the people that were here were known as the Clovis people. They were the one of the earliest people to inhabit North America. And they hunted with mostly spears, thrusting and throwing spears. These spears were two-part tools. This is a foreshaft and this is the main shaft. And this is fitted into a socket. And this is a classic Clovis point, which was a fluted point. It had a channel flake knocked out so it could be fitted onto this foreshaft. And then this is wrapped in sinew as the tying material. Again, this has got spruce pitch with charcoal added to it. It makes a great glue. Back then, the wood available would be a lot of spruce because this was a boreal forest area back when the ice sheets left. And there was birch here, so the foreshafts were probably made from birch, which is a harder wood. This one is made with a fire-hardened tip on it, so it's a little bit sturdier. And anyway, these were interesting weapons because if they were thrown or thrust into the prey animal, if they were thrown, this thing would go in, maybe hit a dense mass of muscle or bone, and the main shaft would fly back. This would stay in the animal. And so a hunter could take out of his quiver a second one of these and hook it to his shaft here and be ready to go again. So these were the earliest hunting tools. Later, as the megafauna, as they call them, the large animals that inhabited the area after the ice left, they became slowly extinct, and there was a whole bunch of reasons, hypotheses why that happened. We don't need to get into that. As my pastor friend would say, that's a sermon for another day. But anyway, to make a long story short, the next hunting phase, after the megafauna were gone, and we were into what we call the Archaic period, the early Archaic period in New York, people were using atlatls or throwing sticks. This is an atlatl. Got a little leather strap that you can put your fingers through and hold it. And this is what was called a dart. And the dart had a little depression in the back end, and it was held like this with the fingers. And it was held this way. And when you threw this, you kept your elbow flat. You brought your arm up, and this thing would release and throw the dart. Now this gave it a tremendous mechanical advantage because it extended your arm about 2 feet. So if you ever, I don't know, as a kid, a lot of kids, when I was a boy, we used to take sticks and poke them in apples under the apple trees and could throw those apples far. And that's the same principle here. It gives you a mechanical advantage of greater leverage. And this tool also had a foreshaft and a main shaft many times, but the points, the projectiles, were much smaller because the native people were hunting smaller game. No longer were they hunting woolly mammoths and bison antiquus, these big animals, and even large animals like short-faced bear. All these animals are extinct now, but they were hunting big animals. But later in the Archaic period, the animals were like what we see today: elk, moose, black bear, white-tailed deer, things like that. So the weaponry kind of scaled down. And then as we move along in time, more towards current day, the bow and arrow came into vogue. People picked this technology up I'm not sure when it came to North America. There's a lot of different dates people give. So suffice it to say, maybe 1,000, 1,500 years ago in this area, the bow and arrow may have been common. Now, this is an Iroquois longbow, and it's a replica of a longbow that was made by a Tuscarora person in western New York, and the real item is out in the Buffalo Museum. A friend of mine who used to be a bowyer, he'd reproduce Native American bows, went out there and he measured this original bow, got all the measurements, call that surveying the bow, and then produced those, gave those to people, and then we were able to make a replica. So this is a replica of the Iroquois longbow, Tuscarora longbow, and I'll string it. It's also called a D bow. Try to show you why. The shape of this bow is shaped like a D in cross section. So it's either called a D bow or a longbow. The longbow is pretty tall. This one's about, I guess, 5 feet, a little over 5 feet. And the arrows that the Iroquois people and the Algonquian people were using at the time of European contact were similar to this. They had 2 vanes or 2 feathers, and they had a small triangular point, which archaeologists call a Madison point. And the shafts were made out of any straight shrub or tree sapling. In this area, northern arrowwood is a shrub. It's a viburnum, and it grows very straight stems, so there's not a lot of straightening to be done when you need an arrow shaft. And so these arrows were all shaped with a bulbous knock. You can see this knock on the end here is a little bit fatter than the rest of the shaft. And the shaft itself is barrel shaped. It's the thickest in the middle, thinnest at both ends. And they used a bulbous knock because they used what was called a pinch grip. And most Native Americans would grab the knock with their index finger and thumb, pull the string back and release and shoot. So they had a bulbous knock to facilitate the grip. This bow, excuse me, is made from white ash, and at 28 inches of draw, it's about 44 pounds of weight. It's a pretty strong bow. It can easily dispatch the animals that were running around at the time. Okay, so some of the other things about arrows. The points were made from chert or stone. Some were made from bone. This is a bone fishing point. It's serrated, and there's a little hole in the bottom so you can attach some cordage to it to retrieve it when you kill your fish. This is called a bird blunt. It's made from wood that's carved out of the main shaft of the arrow. And this is an arrowhead made from an antler tine. So those were some of the ways that arrows were made. Okay, so when we got done hunting, we had some meat, we had some leather for hides, for clothing. And so in order to sew, they had to have tools. So some of the tools you would need would be an awl and needles. Dennis Stanford, who is a archaeologist, anthropologist with the Smithsonian Institution, claims that the sewing needle was one of the most important tools that Native American people had, especially in a climate like we have here now and in like what we had after the Ice Age. Very cold, you need clothing. So anyway, these are bone awls. This is a bone awl. It's a really pointed tool made from a cannon bone, a leg bone of a deer. This bone was just taken, and you can take a hammer stone, put it on another stone, smack it really hard, break it, and this would splinter into pieces and leave you something pretty sharp, like this. Then this can be further sharpened by polishing or braiding with a a braiding stone or a sandstone. These can be found virtually everywhere. So you just rub and rub and rub until you get this thing really sharp, and you'll punch a hole through leather pretty handily. So here we have it. Punching through, this is another type of an awl. It's a sort of a deformed antler, which gives you a nice kind of a ball to hold in your hand as you push through the leather. And then needles. This is a little tool called, I call it a needle safe. It's a portion of a leg bone of a bison. And in New York State, back in the Archaic period, there were bison here, wood bison, and there were elk here. There were some species were here then that are not here now. So anyway, so bison bone would have been available. This is a little wooden plug that once you get the marrow out of these bones, they're hollow. And inside here are a bunch of bone needles. I don't know if you can see these, but these are all made from the fractured leg bone of a deer. And those little holes are drilled in there with a tool called a graver. A graver would be a tool like this flint chip. You take the pointed end and you'd use it as a little hand drill to make a hole. You can unstring this one. A little piece of sinew on here. We got to talk about sinew in a minute. So this is a needle with some sinew, and you can see we could easily use it to sew. Okay, let's look at the sinew. Sinew is derived from animals. It's a material that connects muscle to bone, and we all have it in us. If you look at your own arm, you'll see that here's a bone down here at your elbow, and some of the muscle in your forearm is connected to that bone by sinew or tendon. So you've all heard of tendonitis, sadly, right? So anyway, we have sinew here from a bunch of different animals. This is backstrap sinew from a bison. It's very thick and very heavy because a bison is a big, heavy animal. And the backstrap sinew comes from along the spinal cord, both sides of the spinal cord of these animals. This is a little thinner but long. This is from an elk. This is backstrap sinew. This is backstrap sinew from a white-tailed deer. The way the sinew was turned into thread was just by simply taking it and pulling the fibers apart in your hand and breaking them down into threads. And this is an example of a finished threading process. Now these are short because these particular pieces of sinew here were short, but this is about as long as you could get your thread. It wasn't super long. Sometimes the thread was made into cordage, and that's a whole another process. And by the way, if you're interested in any of these processes, flint knapping or making cordage, just go to YouTube. There's tons of videos on these subjects today. This is a sinew from the lower leg of a bison. So again, it's the connective tissue between muscle and bone, or it's a tendon. So that was used for sewing and making all kinds of things, including bowstrings. Any place where cordage was needed, oftentimes sinew is used. Now, you may have noticed that the back of this bow is painted red. So it's painted with two things. It's painted with hide glue, and it's painted with pigment from a stone. And these are called red ochre. The stone is a mineral with lots of iron in it, which makes it red. And so once you grind these stones, you can get a nice red powder, which is called red ochre. And then with this bow, I just took hide glue, by the way, which was made from scraping animal hides. And you take this, when you're making clothing, or you're brain tanning a hide, you get those scrapings, you cook them down in a bowl. And there are two proteins that are released, elastin and I forget the name of the other one, of course. But anyway, these two proteins make the glue. It's real sticky. So if you have a tool or an implement made with sinew or other kinds of rawhide materials, these stretch when they're wet, and hide glue goes back into solution when it's wet. So you wouldn't want to hunt or fight in the rain, because most of your tools would become ineffective in that way. Okay, moving on, we got a bunch of other things to look at. We talked earlier about the making of stone tools from the flakes, and this is a stone-tipped drill. And drill bits were made to look like this. They either had a kind of a wide spot at the top, where they were shaped like a T, like this one, so that they could be put into the shaft and then bound with sinew or rawhide and glued. And so you would have a drill here. You have the shaft and the bit. And this was used, you could use it like this as a hand drill. Or you could use it as a bow drill. I don't know if you can see the start of the hole right there. When you use it as a bow drill, you would put this on like this, and then there'd be a holding, usually a stone with a hollowed out pit in it, and you spin this by pulling this back and forth. So they could drill, they could cut, they could work wood, could do a lot of things with these stone tools. Okay, a couple of other binding cordage materials real quick. Rawhide is just basically the hide of an animal, in this case deer. This is a piece of deer hide. You take the hair off, dehair it. That's a process that's fairly simple. I mean, you soak these hides in water for a while, and the hair loosens and slips, and it comes right off. And then you just have what's called a piece of rawhide. It's pretty hard, but when you wet it, it becomes very soft and stretches. So I call this nature's stretch wrap material. You could take rawhide and you could, this is just a camp hammer, all-purpose camp hammer. It's just a stone with a groove pecked into it, and then a wooden handle put on like this. And then this wet rawhide was cut and wrapped over this and sewed down both sides with sinew, and then left to dry. And when it dried, it would shrink and make this stone head be affixed real tightly to the handle. So a lot of that was used for that purpose. And rawhide, of course, was used for a bunch of other things. And there's a drum down here that's made from rawhide, which we'll look at later, a little later. It's called a hand drum. And it's just simply, again, wet rawhide stretched over a wooden frame and then bound with wet strips of rawhide on the back. When it dries, it all pulls real tightly together and gives you a drum. As we move on in time again, the native people in New York became farmers, hunters and farmers and gatherers. And the early people were not farmers, they were just hunters and gatherers. They didn't have the farming expertise developed yet, but once they did, The three main crops were in the eastern United States, what is now the United States: corn, beans, and squash. And so if you produced corn, you needed tools to take the kernels off the cobs, to grind those down and make flour. And this is a deer jawbone, and this makes a real handy tool for taking off the kernels. I'm not going to do it here and make a big mess, but if you put enough pressure down on this, the kernels pop right off, and it saves you from using your hands to do that. So again, very simple tool made from what was available, a deer jaw. The eating of foods, most foods were prepared or cooked in a larger pot or kettle type of an arrangement. Many of these were made of clay in the later parts of the Native American occupation. And they would boil water by putting water in a clay pot, taking stones, heating them in a fire, and then dropping them in the pot. And that would cause the water to get hot and boil, and you could make soups and stews and cook various things. Some tools for cooking and eating. These are a couple of spoons. This is a spoon made from the top portion of a skull of a deer and running down the nose. So that would make a nice spoon. And this could be fairly easily cut with a flint or chert flake by just working a line around the skull of the deer until it's detached. This is a large ladle made from a bison horn, like this. This would have been the horn. And in this same way, cut very patiently and slowly with a flake knife to get this. And then it can be polished, like this one was, with various grits of sand, like we use sandpaper today. You can just go into any small creek and find different sizes of sand particles. You could start off coarse and go to fine, and eventually you get the polish that you want. All of this tool making, as you can imagine, is really tedious and labor intensive, so none of it was easy. Some of the tools they used to gather in wood or tree product, trees, were stone axes. This is a stone axe called a celt, C-E-L-T. And these tools were made to fit into a wooden handle, but they were made in a wedge shape. This is a little bit more accentuated shape. This is also a celt. This one was made from chert that I got from Indiana. This one's made from hornfells, which is a metamorphosed clay, which came from Massachusetts. And this one was made by pecking the stone with a hammer stone, breaking it up into little tiny flakes that come off, and then polishing it with other stones. So it's called pecking and polishing is the process by which these are made. So once these are hafted and they're shaped this way, the harder you hit with them, the more firmly they're driven into the handle. So they don't usually come loose with use. This one's got some spruce pitch as a glue to hold it in place more firmly, and the handle's made from a piece of hickory. Another way that the native people would take a tree down would be to create a fire around the base of the tree and actually burn the base of the tree. And that would create char or charcoal. And then you can take a stone axe and chop away the char much more easily than you can cut wood with it. So that was called charring and scraping, charring and chopping. There's a little cup here. This I made by charring and scraping. It's just a burl or a growth that was on the side of a tree. And then what you do is you take some hot coals from your fire and set them on here and blow on them, kind of get them to burn the wood, and it takes a long time. And then you take a chert flake and you scrape and scrape. You can use a tool like, let's see if I can find it. It's on here someplace. It's a scraper, hafted scraper. So much stuff right in front of me. If it was any closer, it would have hit me. So this is a hafted scraper. It's a piece of Burlington chert from Illinois. And this is a nice long handle, so you could really get in there and scrape away. A tool like this could also be used for fleshing a hide. When you're going to do brain tanning, the worst things you do is you have to take the hair off the hide. You have to scrape all the meat and grizzle off. And scrape the epidermis off and the endoderm, which is inside portion of the hide. Got to get all that off, and then you're left with what's called the mesoderm, or the inner part of the hide, which can be once it's scraped. This is a brain tan smoked piece of buckskin. Once it's all scraped down and it's broken, you can do that by pulling it around a tree like this. You break the fibers in the hide. It becomes fairly soft, and you take the brains of the animal, which have a high oil or fat content, and you rub them on here all over this hide, and then keep working it and working it. And finally it comes out quite soft and very white. Then the smoking process is where you would hang this on a rack and you'd create a smoky fire underneath. And the smoke puts tars and oils into the hide, which keeps it a little bit more waterproof than it would normally be. And if it does get wet, it would then remain supple rather than getting real stiff again. So anyway, here's an example of a finished garment. This is a shirt, and this shirt would take probably 3 good-sized deer hides to make this shirt. And this shirt, you would need to have sewing tools, obviously, to put these hides together. And this is an example of a brain tan smoked buckskin garment. We'll quickly move over to a few other general implements here. These are 2 different hair combs. This is made from the palm of a moose antler, and it's got what I call a classic Iroquois motif, the kissing birds, I call it. And this is another comb that's made from the palm of a foreign deer, actually. This is an Austrian fallow deer. But this same type of a comb could have been made from moose palm. And this has got a little turtle motif cut into it. So these would have been made, real laborious process of scraping these grooves with flint tools or chert tools, and then drilling the holes that were drilled with the chert tip drill. So there's those, a couple of combs. Keep your hair in place and get rid of the lice. Lice were pretty common then. This is a tool that in the Arctic would be called a slotted ulu. And this was used for scraping and chopping and all kinds of different tool applications. It's got a little slot in the top. Probably can't really see that, and then there's a piece of antler that is held on with rawhide that was wet and then allowed to dry and shrink. And this was held in the hand and used as a chopping. Now in the Iroquoian area, the Algonquian area here, these were referred to by the archaeologists as women's knives because they were typically used by women in household activities, cooking and hide preparation, different things like that. This is made from slate. And again, this slate was pecked out of a larger piece of slate and then ground and polished so that it has a fairly sharp cutting edge on it. To hold different things, you needed to have items or implements to carry stuff in. So of course baskets were a great way to move product around. I showed you this little cup, which would be used for drinking. This is a piece of gourd that simply cut the gourd in half essentially, and it makes a nice little bowl. This one, this gourd actually cracked, and to show how native people could repair soapstone bowls or other bowls, and even wood or bowls like this, they sometimes would stitch the crack closed and then apply pitch, spruce or pine or fir pitch to seal that crack, and then you could continue to use it. This is just a wooden bowl, and this is a ready-made bowl once you got your snapping turtle dispatched and undangerous. You could to harvest the shell, and this could be used to great thing for berry picking, or putting small things to move them. Other things that were designed to carry items. This is a quiver. This is made from a buckskin that was partially tanned. This was not finished. So what I did was I just dehaired this hide and I fleshed it, and I started to break it a little bit so it's somewhat soft, but it's not as soft as the fully brain tanned. This has a stiffening rod. Most of these Native American quivers that were made like this from tanned or partially tanned hide had a rod in them that was used to keep the quiver upright so you could easily fetch and put arrows in them. Moving on to some other items, we've got a couple of warfare implements. This is an elk antler that was cut down to make it into basically a killing tool, a handheld club in a sense with a sharp point. This is a ball-headed war club made from wood. A lot of charring and scraping and manipulating this thing to get it made. And that was another kind of a head bopper. And this one is a smaller war club that was made from a small beech tree that had a burl, or like a wart, growing on the side of it. So this was just, the bark was, I skinned all the bark off of it, and I just polished it up a bit with some braiding stones, drilled a hole in it, put a little brain tan buckskin thong on it, and so that's that. Sometimes I give this talk to fourth graders, and I usually leave out these tools that are hurtful. And we have some implements here that were used to make noise or music, if you would want to call it that. And these were rattles. There's several rattles here. This is a rattle made from a gourd with the hole in the top and bottom, and then a wooden stick run up through, and then there's some basswood, inner bark of basswood that I wrapped around there, wet and glued in place with hide glue. And there's little stones in there, so it makes a kind of a distinctive noise. This is a rattle made from deer hooves, and the hooves are detached from the bone. There's a process you go through to do that. But then when you shape this, it makes a kind of a different sound, kind of a nice little, and usually used for different rituals by Native people. A lot of them involve dancing and chanting and things like that. This is a knee rattle, and this would have been tied around your leg below your knee. And so when you dance, and this is one on each leg, and it would make that noise. This is a bison rib bone. And again, you have some deer hooves attached along that, so when you take it. Two more rattles. This one's a shell rattle. Something like this you would find more in the coastal region where shells were abundant. If you found something like this here, it was to tell you that there was some trade going on between the different tribes. That was very common in Native American culture. There were trade routes and a lot of trade was going on. Different materials from different areas were valued, so they were swapped and traded. This is a small turtle shell rattle. Again, it's got little stones in it, and a little wooden handle. And last on the rattles is this is an elm bark rattle. Elm bark was used for lots of things in Iroquoian times, even for siding on their longhouses. Their longhouses were sheathed in elm bark. And so they made baskets from this and things that were quite large like this, and smaller baskets that may have been flat, and they made a lot of rattles like this. And this has just got a corn cob stuck in this. You just take the bark off when it's wet and green in the springtime, and you fold it back on itself. It tends to curl around itself, and you just can put a plug in it, anything, a piece of wood, a stick, corn cob, and put some round pebbles in. It's a nice rattle. And this is a drum, hand drum, which is made from rawhide. As I said earlier, this is just stretched around the frame. Usually it was just a single hoop of ash wood or something that can be easily wet and bent and then tied together on the ends, kept in place. And stretch the hide over it. And as long as it's not damp or rainy that day, you can make a good noise. But because dampness and raininess affects the rawhide, it'll stretch and it wouldn't be useful as a drum until the weather got better. So that's pretty much everything I have, I think. So anyway, thanks for listening and watching. I hope it was edifying. I hope you learned something. And if you need to know more about these crafts, just go to YouTube. There's tons and tons of stuff on YouTube. When I started this 35 years ago, there wasn't a YouTube, and so everything had to come out of books and talking to other people that did this. But it's great today, so modern times, modern technology, and that's what brings this talk to you via Zoom. So that's it for me. Have a great time.